Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, London Paul. London Paul runs an independent news website with the purpose of giving an alternative perspective on mainstream news regarding recent developments that are shaping a new political, economic, and social paradigm. You can see all his work on his website, SiriusReport.com, or you can visit his YouTube channel called The Sirius Report. I'll put all the links at the bottom of the video. Paul, welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight.
Well, good afternoon, Dave, and it's a pleasure to be back.
Hey, thanks for coming back. And I wanted to start off with what is happening with the cabal and the Trump administration. Now, there are many people out there that believe Trump is part of the cabal, part of the New World Order. He's working for them. But as we can see what's happening out in the world, that just doesn't hold up right now. Now, I wanted to start off with, what is happening with the Trump administration, with the cabal. Is there a big battle going on right now? And who is winning this battle?
Yeah, undoubtedly, there has been a battle since the day Trump won the election, never mind his inauguration. And there was certainly a plan. Trump talked about draining the swamp. Now, the swamp could be the deep state, the cabal, whatever anyone wants to refer to them as. And certainly originally there's what I'll refer to as Plan A. And Plan A was to try drain the swamp internally within the Washington apparatus. And they quickly realized how difficult and problematic that was. Obviously, there was a lot of resistance from Congress and the Senate. We know all the problems that happened internally. So the issue of Bannon leaving wasn't what people suspected. And I said to our podcast subscribers, look, Plan B is coming in. Now, Plan B basically decided to take the initiative away from Washington and directly from Trump. So people couldn't actually sort of frame him directly for what's going on, but to take the initiative to drain the swamp out of Washington and to be done independently. And Bannon was part of that process, not entirely. There's quite a lot of very influential people in America who have a lot of power and influence that people probably aren't aware of, and it's probably good they're not. But these are part of the process of, people say reestablishing the American Republic. You can say what you like, it's basically removing the swamp and allowing the US to become a great nation amongst equals and not something that's being plagued by the cabal for however long it is, 100 years plus. And Trump's true role as president, a lot of people get frustrated saying, well, what's he doing with tax reform? What's he doing in terms of the financial system? And what's he doing in terms of infrastructure rebuild in the US? Well, yes, these are obviously clearly important things that need to be addressed. But essentially, his role, as we said previously, was to take a wrecking ball to the cabal, the deep state, nothing more, nothing less. So at times, some of his foreign policy decisions do seem a little bit sort of skewed. I mean, we'll talk about Ukraine in some detail a bit later on, but in terms of the lethal weapons, yes, the US has provided lethal weapons, but what it means is that Kiev now has a mix of Russian and US military hardware. That's a retrograde step for Ukraine in terms of military operations. It's not something that's progressive for them. So you have to look in a little bit of detail as to why things are being done. Same with declaring Jerusalem as the de facto capital of Israel. That's designed to force Palestine and Israel to resolve their differences. And yeah, it was quite inflammatory. It upset a lot of people. But there was a reason behind it. And Russiagate is another great example. The whole sort of Mueller investigation. Everyone's foaming at the mouth about it, but who cares? There's no point getting rid of Mueller because the entire Russia sort of shitstorm, pardon my language, but it is, that went on in Washington. It's a kind of well-engineered Trojan horse that was allowed to happen by the Russians and by Trump because it was the only way to bring down the deep state. And it's had a very successful strategy because it's exposed the cabal and what goes on inside, for example, the FBI and the Department of Justice. It's exposed the Democrats and it's significantly weakened them, and principally the mainstream media, they all took the bait without knowing that it would be their undoing. And the house cleaning consequences in the US will spread globally to a place like Saudi, whether people agree or not. Mohammed bin Salman, that was part of the process, and it will continue in the Middle East. You've also got Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, basically the entire world. Now, this house cleaning, this draining the swamp is going to probably be absolutely mind-bending for most people. But the reality is the entire corrupt cabal network is being taken down in totality. There's none of this idea that this faction is going to take over and rule the world for the next 100 years. It's simply not going to happen. And I've said that back in August when we were last on, and I'll reiterate that point again. Now, in terms of the swamp, or I refer to it as the cesspit being drained, there's a lot of talk of these indictments, and indeed these indictments are correct. It doesn't really matter at this point discussing who precisely these people are, but it's been a very long, protracted process. I mean, some of these documents, and they go to the, in length of tens of thousands of pages per individual. Now, there's been talk about Guantanamo Bay being potentially used to house, people from the deep state, the cabal. Yes, that's very much on the card. The FEMA camps will be used. And notice how all these ex-Walmart stores were purchased. They're going to be used for that very same purpose. Now, people are obviously saying, when's all this going to happen? It doesn't really matter when. The important thing is it happens at the right time and in the right sequence of events to make sure that these indictments stick. And if people are adjudicated and found to be guilty, they are found to be guilty, and they don't have sort of legal loopholes to wriggle out of being found adjudicated for. Even though we all think there's some very obvious people who've committed some heinous crimes, that's not really the point. Now, there's also an international coordination of this in terms of the assets that people have and the personnel. So via, for example, the likes of Interpol, we're going to see increasing numbers of resignations of executives in corporations, that politicians not standing for re-election. I think we're starting to already see, and is the Clinton Foundation is going to come back under the microscope. I think the paedophilia and the human traffickers are going to sort of be found wanting via this Trump asset seizure executive order. That was a massive piece of news that came out that largely fell under the radar, but it's a perfect method by which to tackle the deep state cabal and to bring them down. And that's why that executive order came out, but it was largely not noticed by people. So no, absolutely not. Trump is not part of the cabal. Trump is playing a game, and you have to play the game to defeat them. He didn't take the presidential role to be the president like normally presidents are, who were all puppets for the deep state cabal. He was very much a lone ranger. He can't be bribed. He's got billions of dollars. He's not someone who can be corrupted. And they realized that. And in the process, that's why they've been trying to remove him and take him down and frame him over things like Russiagate and try to implicate him, in all manner of things and impeach him, which they haven't succeeded, because they know he's taking a wrecking ball to the cabal. That's always been his job, and it always will be. And it's a pretty thankless task, but he could have quite easily slipped into retirement and played golf 7 days a week or whatever he wants to do. But he took this role on knowing full well it's a very dangerous role as well. There is a lot of risk to his own, personal safety in the process. But Plan B is underway, and these indictments and every aspect of taking the cabal down will unfold, and I expect we'll see some evidence of that to a larger or lesser extent in 2018. Precisely when isn't the issue, as I always say. Everything's event-driven. It's not time-driven. So when people give you dates, they're just speculating. And eventually, it's like a broken clock. It's right twice a day. At some point, someone's going to be correct, but it's not because they actually know precisely the date when things will happen. They're just speculating, and that's why I never get drawn on dates. But certainly that event-driven scenario of draining the swamp is gathering momentum, and a lot of the stuff that's out there in the alternative media and that makes reference to this is correct. But as I say, don't get drawn on dates because it can get very frustrating for people.
Now, Paul, let me ask you this. Now, you're saying there's thousands of indictments. Number one, will these people just, allow themselves to be ushered into court, stand trial? Are they just going to sit back and let this happen? Number two, when the truth comes out and they find out who these individuals are and what they've done, isn't this going to cause problems in the United States, around the world, where everyone's looking at this saying, oh my God, this is really what's been happening? We've been lied to all this time. And, depending on what the indictments are and what they're bringing up, how do you see this playing out?
Well, yeah, there is the issue of, I think certainly to some extent, depends on people how, with their position in the food chain, but there will be certain people indicted. There may be plea bargains where someone gives information that will take down 50 other people and in the process. And I don't doubt that's probably ongoing, and those kind of discussions will happen. I think, given the nature of what's happening, these people at these levels who will be indicted will have little choice but to face the consequences. Some may argue that some of them might try and suicide themselves. That is a possibility. You can't rule it out. But you make a very salient point when you say, what are the consequences? Because everybody always wants, well, let's expose the cabal. Let's frame all these people for everything they've done. But there are consequences because their actions don't involve just domestic matters. They involve international matters, and it may cause huge international diplomatic incidents in the process when this disclosure happens. So there is, people argue you need to tell everyone everything, and it's hard to argue against it. But sometimes it's going to have to be handled pretty delicately to avoid massive diplomatic and international incidents. But yeah, I think it's going to be a big shock for a lot of people, particularly, if certain people in the US are ending up being indicted. You're going to see a lot of people there who know nothing who are going to find this incredibly shocking. And it's not just going to be in the US, it will be across Europe and across the world, as we said earlier. So yes, there are a lot of consequences for these actions, and therefore there needs to be some thought process as to how this is handled. And depending on the nature of what these individuals have done, and some of it can be pretty heinous and involve huge swathes of the planet in the process, this is going to be a difficult one to handle. But it's something that has to be done, because you can't allow these individuals who've committed these crimes just to walk away into the sunset.
Now, we know the cabal. I mean, I've been tracking this and reporting on it. And, a lot of people, I see a lot of stories out there saying, no, Trump is starting war. He's building troops up. He's going to be starting a war with North Korea because, he says a lot of things on Twitter. The corporate media pushes a lot of propaganda. To me, this is all the part of the game where he's confusing the corporate media, confusing what's going on around the world. And he's secretly behind the scenes, he's doing other things. And what we see in Ukraine, the corporate media was right out there saying, oh, lethal weapons. And we discussed this just before, lethal weapons are heading towards Ukraine. This is going to be great. This is going to help them. We're going to see war. Same thing with North Korea. Their missiles can reach the United States. They can blow us up. We need to be prepared for nuclear war. Now, when we look at Ukraine, we look at North Korea, let's start off with those two. I mean, what has he been doing with these countries compared to what the corporate media has been trying to, push on us?
Yeah, I think they're very good points. Let's start with Ukraine and we can talk in some details. Yes, the US was supplying these lethal weapons, anti-tank weapons, etc. And there's all this consternation, and Moscow apparently, saying, oh, it's a declaration of war, etc. And it seemed as though it was going to, not just freeze the, relations between the two nations, i.e. the US and Russia, but it's actually going to put it in the deep freeze permanently. But then we note the following, and this is where it's always the context that I think is most interesting. Now, the Obama administration banned meetings between senior military leaders in NATO and their Russian counterparts after Moscow annexed Crimea, as a fallout of the Ukraine crisis. And no such meetings occurred since then. So I think it's obviously they annexed Crimea back in early 2014, but I think the last meeting prior to that was 2013. So we're probably talking nearer 4 years than 3 years. Now, what pops out of the blue? Senior military leaders in NATO and Russia are planning to meet in Azerbaijan later this month. And also, coincidentally, the Trump administration is beginning the new year with several sort of high-level engagements with the Russian government. And this apparently follows a downturn in relations between the US and Russia after the Trump administration's decision to approve the transfer of these anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. Well, clearly that contradicts it totally. Why are they planning these sort of, high-level engagements? I mean, other meetings planned for January and February include talks on Ukraine, ironically, between Vladislav Surkov, who's one of Putin's top aides, and Kurt Volker, who's the special envoy to the US for Ukraine. There's also going to be discussions over long-standing issues in US-Russian relations. That's between Tom Shannon, now he's a number 3 official at the State Department, and Sergei Ryabkov, who's Russia's deputy foreign minister, and they're going to have conversations relating to this intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, the INF, which is supposed to be this big bone of contention that could lead to war. Well, no, it's not. So clearly the isolation campaign's over. And this is a dramatic U-turn in inverted commas. We can now see that US-Russian relations require more bilateral engagement. And this is on the back of Mueller's ongoing investigations. Now, what also interests me is this is all in the pipeline, and we're not seeing Congress, the Senate, the Democrats, or the Republicans, or anyone else foaming at the mouth about this new kind of turnover and dramatic U-turn in relations between the US and Russia. Now, in terms of what's really going on in Ukraine, well, civil war continues, which is largely unreported in Donbass. There's daily ceasefire breaches, which are numerous. Now, the backdrop is that the Minsk II agreements was designed to create a ceasefire between Ukraine government forces and these people, militias in the self-proclaimed republics in Donetsk and Lugansk, and then the subsequent withdrawal of heavy weapons from the line of engagement. There was supposed to be a roadmap for a lasting settlement in Ukraine with local elections and constitutional reform, which was to give more autonomy to the war-torn eastern regions. Now, these agreements were never implemented. The Ukrainian side was dodging implementation, citing security problems, which is utter nonsense. And Ukraine has failed to carry out constitutional reform and to inform, the law on the region's special status and to pass a law on elections in Donbass. So instead, it insists on regaining control over the border with Russia, which is supposed to only take place after the elections as envisaged by the Minsk agreements. Now, the idea is that Russia's stonewalling and obstructing this. Everybody in the world, including the Europeans and the Americans, know it's simply Kiev. Now, what was also interesting in terms of this thaw in relations is that the Ukrainian foreign minister, who's Pavel Klimkin, he met up with his Russian counterpart, who's obviously Sergei Lavrov. And that was on the sidelines of the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And that was at the back end of 2017. Now, they had met for the Ukrainians and the Russians for about 3 years at that point, probably even 4 years. And this was a clear attempt by Ukraine to bring an end to the Donbass civil war. And it is a civil war because the Ukrainians realized they were dragged into it merely as a pawn in a futile game by the Washington Kabbalists. Now, what's also recently come about is the Ukrainians are saying, well, I think it's about time we had a meeting between Ukraine and Russia's leaders. It could be a major step forward towards settling the conflict and the civil war there, and that such a meeting could tackle all aspects of the settlement, except for Ukraine's territorial integrity. But we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So there's certainly a thawing between the Ukrainians and the Russians and the Americans and the Russians, not just with regards to Ukraine, but obviously we're talking about Ukraine. Now, other interesting developments that often go under the radar, which always I think are very interesting. Kiev is seeking to rotate east. We always make this comment about the best way to describe how nations are seeking to move away from the Kabbalists in the West to the One Belt, One Road and the AIIB, etc. in the East. Now, at the back end of last year, a Chinese delegation visited Kiev, and they signed off on a host of new infrastructure projects and investments in Ukraine, which are intended to integrate into the One Belt, One Road initiative. And it also will provide Kiev with much needed economic assistance. And ironically, it will move Kiev ever closer east via China. And the intended goal is also towards Russia. And this is another example of Russia and China having joined up thinking with regards to an issue which obviously has far-reaching consequences, including the fact that this remains the reason, in inverted commas, why sanctions continue against Russia, which is deeply damaging nations only in the EU and not Russia. Now, in terms of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, it's going to eventually be broken up into around 4 or 5 pieces. At some point, it will seek partnership with Russia, politically and militarily. It'll be rebuilt with Chinese investment and be another conduit into Western Europe. It will revamp the Ukrainian transportation infrastructure to serve as a portal into Europe for China's One Belt, One Road initiative. Because Ukraine, if you look at it geographically, is seen as one of the logistics and industrial hubs en route to the European Union. And the economic incentives alone are going to encourage Ukraine to seek to achieve Beijing's goals because they want Kiev to be a stable, reliable partner through which Chinese goods can flow into Europe. And I think the initial aim is to implement probably around $10 billion in joint projects between China and Ukraine. Now, despite all this angst that goes on and bravado between Ukraine and Russia, What may come as a big surprise to everyone is that Russia continues to remain Ukraine's top export destination and biggest foreign investor. Now, reality is all too often belie the bravado that's seen on the world stage, and there's a great example of it. But of course, in inverted commas, this economic divorce between Russia and China left Ukraine looking for new markets to sell its goods. And as new foreign investors were needed to kickstart its economy, China moved in. Another example of the short-sighted views in terms of Ukraine from the cabal perspective. So China has begun to rebuild Ukraine's transportation infrastructure. They're planning on building a passenger railway which will connect Kiev International Airport and Kiev with Ukraine's Yuzhny port, which is the country's biggest. Also, the Chinese Bohai Commodity Exchanges acquired the Ukrainian Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and they use that as a platform for investment in Ukraine by the Chinese. Now, the irony is that the war in Donbass, which was instigated by the Western Kabbalists, coupled with the corruption of the Poroshenko Western-backed government, led to the lack of the Western investment in Ukraine. As we said, so China seized upon it. Now, despite all the rhetoric, the EU and the US have grown tired of the Poroshenko government because it's failed to serve the intended purpose of destabilizing Russia directly and indirectly. And they're now actually launching attacks on the Kiev government themselves. The European Union withheld a 600 million euro tranche of a larger 1.8 billion euro package to Ukraine. And the US State Department issued this blunt statement urging Ukrainian lawmakers, to deal with the anti-corruption efforts. So China sees a perfect opportunity to gain leverage through investment opportunities, and they're not tied to any preconditions that the West seeks to impose on Ukraine, which of course is exactly what the West has done with Ukraine, as the Ukrainian people have realized. So it rotates Ukraine away from Europe because the West wants to impose conditions which Ukraine finally has woken up and realizes are intolerable. So it paves the way for this long process of normalization of relations between Ukraine and Russia, which is, also China as well as Russia's long-term intention of goal. Now, China and Russia obviously have different goals and views in some ways with Ukraine, but China sees its approach will ultimately see Ukraine rotating back to Russia. And the recent visit by the Chinese to Kiev underpins what I've said previously about the Chinese seeking to reshape economies in Central and Eastern Europe. And whilst the Kabbalists are alarmed at these developments, they're powerless to stop Chinese investment and Russian diplomacy and investment opportunities from both the Chinese and the Russians in the future, which will redraw the map as we move towards the new sort of economic financial paradigm. So the Chinese and Russians are always joined at the idea that they don't consult on each other. In every nation they work in, they consult with each other. So they sort of play this perfect chess-like strategy in combating the Kabbalists by making rogue nations like Ukraine offers they simply can't refuse. It accounts for why the EU and the US are turning their backs on the Poroshenko government. And the instability obviously in Kiev remains a concern, as does the risk of another coup to remove Poroshenko. But the commitment by China to invest in Ukraine suggests they see a way out of the current problems inside Ukraine and not least in Donbass. And there is no doubt that involves a strategic approach, involving Russia as well. So it's a clear example of how all the attempts to destabilize Russia fail. And in the process, China has seized an opportunity to economically regenerate and reinvigorate Ukraine, which it desperately needs. But there are always going to be preconditions with regards to this investment. And it very much involves a joined-up way of thinking between the Chinese and the Russians. And despite all the rhetoric, why would the Americans suddenly want to now be talking to the Russians, and why the Ukrainians talking to the Russians? So again, it's never believe what's said in the media. They always want to spin things that World War III is on the horizon, and the Americans are arming Ukrainians to defeat, Donbass and to defeat the Russians and move up to the Russian border. None of this is reality, and the Americans full well know this, but there is a game and they have to play this game. I mean, it'd be very easy for Trump when he was elected to say, well, enough's enough, and we want to restore relations with the Chinese and the Russians. You simply couldn't do that. They had to, there's a long way to go to restore relations in the sense that everyone's aware of it, but certainly in terms of back channels, and Ukraine's one example. There are big moves to to restore confidence and relations between the two nations.
Now, we also see North Korea. I mean, they open up the hotline. They're looking to speak to each other. And, prior to this, you had these analysts on the corporate media telling everyone that, North Korea's missiles can reach the United States. We need to prepare for a nuclear attack. I believe the CDC put out during the Christmas time period instructions on how to prepare for a nuclear war. And, this is all propaganda to make us think that North Korea is going to strike down the United States. And it looked like, to me, everything that I've been watching, Trump was playing the game. And I think behind the scenes, there was Russia, there was China, Trump, South Korea, all working together to create peace. Now, is this what you see happening in North Korea, or do you have a different take on what is happening there?
No, I'd largely agree with you. I mean, it is a lot of propaganda, but the basis for North Korea's developing its nuclear capabilities was in a way they were very fearful, and we said this previously, that of a US invasion and regime change. And there were certain attempts at one time in 2017 to do that, and it failed. And some operatives were no longer basically disappeared, never to be seen again. So who knows what actually happened to them. So there was some justification from the Korean perspective to develop a nuclear arsenal. And it was really, they had no intention of firing missiles at anybody, especially not the US, but certainly not Russia, China, Japan, or South Korea. And what we've certainly seen in recent weeks is there's definitely been a thawing in relations. I mean, I've covered this off in a lot of detail for podcast subscribers, but yes, effectively, now we're seeing the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has said in an address to his nation that conditions must be formed for the normalization of relations between North and South Korea. And they're looking for a breakthrough in relations, which will ultimately, from my perspective, lead to the unification or reunification of both North and South. That's some way down the track, but that's the ultimate goal. And he rightly said, for all the nonsense written about Kim Jong-un in the Western media, he said it's not worth staring at the past and recalling the specifics of relationships with Seoul. Instead of this, relationships between the North and South must be improved. And the idea is to unite the Korean people and put an end to the escalation of tensions in the Korean Peninsula. And last Wednesday, what did South and North Korea, as you said, restored the line of special communication in the village of Panmunjom, I think it's pronounced, on the border between the two nations. And then last Friday, South Korea's Minister of Unification announced that Pyongyang's accepted a proposal from Seoul to hold high-level talks for the first time since, December 2015. Now, it was all initially sort of wrapped up in this idea the parties are going to discuss the possible participation of a North Korean national team in the 2018 Winter Olympic Games, which is scheduled to start in South Korea in February of this year. Now, yes, that's part of it, but the bigger aim is to get these two countries to sit down together and discuss things and normalize relations. That is the most sensible way forward, and it's certainly been a Chinese and Russian initiative. And I think for all the hot air rhetoric coming out of elements within Washington, it's certainly been the Trump administration is ideal that should be what happened. Now, yeah, there was a lot of insults hurled around, but it's all part of a game. It's all part of just trying to convince everyone in the West that it's business as usual. But I said before, and I said back in August when we were last on the X-22, that the US were basically told, look, if you're going to launch a preemptive strike, we'll sink your entire fleet in the South China Sea, and make no bones about it. The Americans have taken it seriously. They know once again that the Russians, and also to a lesser extent the Chinese, military capability is vastly greater than what the US and its coalition partners in NATO have. So militarily, they have a big advantage. But also they've realized, well, what actually are we going to achieve by doing this? So we go in, try to remove Kim Jong-un. What's it going to actually achieve? Well, nothing, because in the new world and how things are unfolding, those kind of actions are in the past. They're no longer going to be tolerated on a world stage. And the US realizes that, and people in the Western media and in Western nations need to appreciate that the US doesn't have the standing on the world stage that they think and imagine it does. And that is but for good reason. In the future, the US will be a strong nation amongst equals, and it will be on the world stage to resolve global problems which will exist in the future in a post-Kabul world. And that's fine, and that's exactly what the US should do. But there has been an enormous climb down in terms of the US attitude towards North Korea. I mean, back in sort of April time in 2017, there was a real risk that some sort of military confrontation may well have happened. That all have, evaporated pretty quickly in the space of a few days, and it's never been on the card since. And I think it is very symbolic that the North Koreans and the South Koreans will eventually resolve the differences. And in the process, it puts a major spanner in the cabal's works, because quite legitimately, at some point, the world's going to say, well, to the US, well, you have no legitimate reason to be in this region anymore. You're not having to defend the South Koreans from the North Koreans. And of course, North Korea is the classic bogeyman that the cabal needs in every part of the world to justify their presence. Well, their presence will no longer be required. And it's a long process, but we're certainly seeing some strides forward. And it's yet another example of how a war in North Korea that everyone still thinks is going to happen. And I said back in August, there's no way it will happen. And I still maintain there's no chance of that happening.
So right now, the cabal is losing Ukraine, North Korea. Everything that they've tried is not working. We also see out in the Middle East, they're not having a huge amount of success there. Now, in Syria, we see things have really turned around. Is the cabal still in control of Syria?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the war's all but over in Syria. However, there are still flashpoints, there are still battles, there are still, Daesh operatives, very much alive and kicking, but they don't really carry the threat they once did. An increase in the Syrian, Assad forces, backed by the Russians, backed by the Iranians, backed by Hezbollah, backed by the Turkish, are, winning that war. But what is abundantly clear is that the US cabal's plan to redraw the map of the Middle East is over. It lies in tatters. And the true events in the Middle East have been this catalyst for this event-driven scenario, which has far-reaching implications. And it's way beyond nations such as Syria and Iraq. Because what we saw in a very broad sense is the Syrian war saw relations between Russia and Iran solidified. It saw the rotation of Turkey to the east towards Russia and China and their cooperation with Iran too. It saw the improvement in bilateral relations between Iran and Iraq, the rotation of Qatar east, and the cementing of relations between Iran and Turkey. And Russia's diplomatic efforts were sealed by the meeting on Russian soil of King Salman and Vladimir Putin, which effectively neutralized Saudi Arabia with respect to Syria. And it saw Riyadh exert this positive influence over Syrian opposition groups who are under its influence, and it makes them accept the stark reality that Assad will be part of the political solution to a post-war Syria. And the move by Qatar and Jordan to positions of neutrality were also most telling, and it was coupled with Egypt, whose bilateral relations shift towards Russia, including foreign policy in the Middle East, has completely shifted the goalpost in terms of Syria and the Middle East in general. Now, Israel remains this complicated problem, not least in terms of the ongoing situation with regards to the future leadership of Netanyahu. And whilst Israel will continue to make noises about Iran and Hezbollah's presence in regions in the vicinity of the Golan Heights, the fact that Russia does have Israel on a leash should not be underestimated, nor should Moscow's impatience with Tel Aviv. And there's a great example of that impatience, because Putin took the time to call all key Western leaders in the Middle East in sort of early December, as well as Trump. But he intentionally did not call Netanyahu, which was a clear signal to Tel Aviv that Moscow's reached breaking point with Israel's intransigent attitude in the region. And it was a stark warning that they better shape up and behave responsibly, particularly at the time in light of those developments in Lebanon, where there was a clear emphasis to try and stoke up a civil war involving the Hezbollah, and it failed and backfired. And in fact, in the process, it actually solidified the Lebanese nation and the Lebanese government. So, and obviously, Saudi had to backtrack with regards to Lebanon, and it's left Israel weak and isolated. And even Erdogan's finally realizing that diplomacy has its benefits, and by agreeing with Iran and Russia that Assad has a legitimate right to remain leader beyond even this transitional phase, Erdogan's been able to secure this huge personal victory by effectively eliminating the Kurds from the Syrian settlement process. That's a big win for him. And whilst these de-escalation zones have been a resounding success, and it's something we said would work, we're equally pleased to see that once the transition's complete, they're going to be disbanded. And that's very important because it prevents the capability of external powers to exert influence in these regions. I'd say the withdrawal of the US from Syria is pretty much a formality, given there will not be this puppet government subservience to Washington going forward. Now, given Russia only entered the war in September 2015, and the fact that in the space of 2 years, they all but ended a war that was deemed unwinnable, they destroyed Daesh and consolidated and strengthened Assad's position in Syria. And their leading efforts to find this diplomatic solution to the political settlement in Syria, I think, will go down in history as a pretty remarkable achievement. And the presence of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah, whose roles should not be underestimated, may continue to cause this paranoia and sort of ignorant response from nations across the West. The reality is that if Assad is in power, he's entitled to have whatever help he seeks from any nation going forward. And whilst the aim of the US cabal and their coalition was to remove Assad, the war in Syria has had the reverse effect. It now cuts across religious and other divides to unify the people after all the years of war and instability and chaos. And I think we can expect to see Western nations begin to resume sort of relations with Assad at some point in 2018, maybe 2019, as the reality of what's truly gone on begins to hit home. Now, in terms of Washington, Syria is still a divisive issue in terms of the Trump administration, because on the one side you had the non-meeting which happened in Vietnam between Trump and Putin, which actually was a meeting, and they both signed up on a US-Russian joint statement on Syria, stressing the need for this inclusive political solution through free and fair elections under the new constitution. Now, the US State Department comes out the following day dissing this whole agreement, saying that it would be continuing a US military presence in Syria and reiterating this ridiculous demand that Assad can't be part of this transitional phase in Syria. Now, it exemplified the problems that exist within the Trump administration. Now, Moscow largely ignored this, and in fact, with a telephone call with Trump on the night that Netanyahu was snubbed, Trump reiterated the same approach, saying it's business as usual. He's very clear that he wanted to work with Russia to bring an end to the war in Syria and find a settlement to bring about lasting peace. This is rather different from the public persona of what they think the Trump administration is doing here. And of course, Trump appears to be very clear-headed about wanting to work with Putin in this regard in Syria. Now, the fact that the State Department then came out stating that Assad's removal was no longer a precondition and that these free and fair elections should occur and Assad's government needed to enter into these substantive negotiations shows that Trump is sort of calling the shots and the US State Department was backing down. Now, interestingly, of course, is Trump also promised Erdogan that day to ensure the stability of a unified Syria, that the US would no longer supply arms to the Syrian Kurdish militia. That was another telling US 180-degree shift. And this, of course, the fact is that Erdogan demanded that the US withdraw forces in Syria, and I think at some point that's a foregone conclusion. Even the Israeli media is now saying there's no point in the US having a presence in Syria, even with respect to their issues with regards to Iranian forces, and that spoke volumes. And even if the US dug its heels in, the fact that the supply lines are now controlled by Turkey, Syria, and Iraq means it's a pretty futile strategic policy. And this all came about after the meeting between the Russian presidential envoy to Syria in Riyadh, and he met with, Mohammed bin Salman. It was a telling move, and also probably why the US State Department undertook this dramatic climb down. The Saudis have softened their stance with regards to the Syrian Geneva talks, and they're expected to facilitate a smoother transition in the negotiation process. So with regards to Syria, we're witnessing this seismic shift in Middle Eastern geopolitics, which has ironically only come about as a result of the Syrian war, which was instigated by the cabal and has proved to be one of the biggest errors in judgment they have ever made. And I think what we've discussed, albeit at some length in this section, highlights this eloquently from my perspective.
Now, we also see that they tried to make another move, and this is with Iran, where there were protests happening in Iran. And, Nikki Haley, she was in the UN. She wanted to get involved in Iran. Corporate media was making a very big deal about their fighting for freedom, democracy. Even Clinton came out and tweeted that, the people, we're with the people. They're fighting for freedom and democracy. What happened in Iran?
Yeah, I mean, we'll just a little bit of brief history. Yeah, there was these anti-government demonstrations. They began in Iran. It was December 28th, and they said it was in protest against price hikes and all these bankruptcies. And there were street clashes that claimed several dozen lives. I think there was some police people died in the unrest. The Iranian authorities have said they've arrested 450 rioters, and they're going to be put on trial soon. It was definitely a Western-backed, Western-influenced agenda. Probably the US, probably maybe the UK, and maybe Israel in the process. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I don't say that the Iranian people don't have some grievances that need to be addressed. I'm sure in the fullness of time there will be. There's also rumours that the ex-Iranian president Ahmadinejad has been arrested for contributing to widespread unrest in the country. There are unconfirmed reports that allege he's been detained and placed under house arrest, but this is following allegations that he either supported or incited, this unrest in Iran. I don't know whether that's been confirmed. It may be speculation, but we'll have to wait and see. What I think backed up the idea that this was very much a Western-backed thing, as you said, is all the usual suspects coming out making these dubious remarks. We also realized that fake protests that they said occurred in Iran, they were actually occurred in several years ago in places like Bahrain, and they were used as propaganda by the West to suggest these protests were widespread. Now, what are the reasons why? Well, the US has realized they can't control Iran militarily or economically. I put an article on our website suggesting there was a risk of a false flag event happening in the Middle East and blaming the Iranians. That seems to be now off the cards. But more interestingly, I think, even than all that, is the close proximity of this development in Tehran and other cities to the recent announcement that China and Iran are working on this cross-currency yuan-rial agreement for settling oil trades. Always revolves around the dollar. We also see between Iran and Russia that Iran are going to use funds from Russia's Exim Bank to implement these, infrastructure projects. There was the Central Bank of Iran, and obviously the Exim Bank signed these deals to pave the way for Russian banks to fund Iranian projects. Now, 4 Iranian banks have signed unlimited financial deals with Exim Bank. That's pretty significant. And they'll provide loans without this ceiling to finance these development projects in Iran. Now, interestingly, of course, as well, is these projects have already applied, or several projects have applied for funds, but their applications need to be assessed in the Central Bank of Iran and the Economic Ministry. And once they've approved it, they then have to be approved by Russia's Exim Bank as the final stage of this process. But this is the first interbank loan from Russia to Iran, and it will effectively step up expansion of economic ties between the two nations, ironically, of course, in non-dollar terms. And based on the agreement, Russian exporters can also use the loans to export technical and engineering services to Iran. So these are very, very important issues that go on in the background as to why things happen when they do. I think it's also interesting that the US media made this big play about highlighting issues within the Iranian economy whilst failing to tell its readership or its listenership or anyone else for that matter that this was largely caused by US sanctions imposed since 1979, the irony of all irony. And then, of course, the US attempt to use the UN to impose additional sanctions on Iran based on just mere protest in the country. And the UN Security Council rebuffed this US attempt to hijack essentially its mandate. They emphasized the need that, the Iranians are fully implementing the nuclear deal and that the US has got to refrain from interfering in internal affairs of other nations. This was notionally, in inverted commas, another major foreign policy blunder for the Trump administration. I think they were fully aware of what was going to happen. And at a meeting of the UN Security Council, Iran just basically said, look, you're acting way beyond the boundaries of what the UN Security Council is supposed to do, and that the United States is abusing its powers as a permanent member, and the UN Security Council agreed. So it was a spectacular own goal. And the idea that they could stoke tensions and overthrow Tehran as a government was just an act of sheer desperation, because it's so farcical to suggest it would ever happen. And very quickly, of course, the one thing the Western media didn't cover was the issue that there was all these pro-government protests with infinitely more people demonstrating their support for Tehran, but of course they neglected to mention that. But in the process, these demonstrations have very quickly died a death. And of course, if the US want to make a big issue about protests going on as a basis for your UN Security Council resolutions, they may want to look at why they're not also following this up in Israel, where for 6 weeks or more there's been pretty intensive protests against Netanyahu for pretty much similar reasons. So the US wants to play that game, then maybe they should look to implement them with Israel, which of course we know they'll never do. But it is another spectacular own goal, and why the cabal's losing control, because they simply now can't control Iran militarily or economically. And the economic viewpoint is the rest of the world saying, well, to the Americans, well, you can quite happily still implement sanctions against Iran, but you know what? We're not going to do it. Europe said it. Russia's not going to do it. China's not going to do it in the rest of the world. And the US has become very isolated in that regard and in that particular policy. But yes, it's another example of Cabal losing huge influence in the region.
Now, we know that they're losing influence in Syria. We see it in Iran right now. They tried something. Ukraine, North Korea. And it seems like it all started with Afghanistan right after the World Trade Center came down and we went into Afghanistan. Trump sent some troops into Afghanistan. And of course, the corporate media was out there saying, see, we're getting back into war. We're sending troops in there. And recently, he stopped funding to Pakistan. Now, is this to push more war in these countries, or is he doing something else behind the scenes?
Okay, well, I think let's first discuss Afghanistan. Historically, of course, it was the big idea that the war on terror, and we've got to go and root out Osama bin Laden, who's hiding in some caves in Afghanistan. Now, of course, if we fast forward 16 years, and the Pentagon justified sending in more troops on the basis of this premise that Afghanistan is at a critical point in its battle against these multiple insurgencies and terror groups. Now, what did this do? It made Beijing and Moscow go, hang on a minute, history is repeating itself. And I always say, rather like following the money, we need to follow where Daesh and the Islamic State go. And Moscow warned that these Daesh terrorists and the Islamic State were seeking to shift the main focus of their activity from Syria and Iraq to Afghanistan and neighboring states. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, they want to move the seat of conflict closer to Russia and the former Soviet Asian republics, the Stans, which is precisely what they're trying to do. Now, Beijing in the process has been actively encouraging Afghanistan and Pakistan to improve relations with each other, strengthen, political trust, enhance cooperation in fields including counterterrorism and security challenges. And in conjunction with China, Afghanistan and Pakistan, they issued a trilateral statement agreeing to establish what would be termed a crisis management mechanism. And that's to include prevention, through effective intelligence, information sharing, and other kind of mutually agreed measures. Now, in further developments, the three nations have agreed to establish economic cooperation in line with the One Belt, One Road. What a surprise. They're also looking to establish peace talks with the Taliban. In essence, this is a coordination and revival of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Afghanistan Contact Group. Now, the global terrorist threat is beginning to move into a new sphere of operations. That, in a post-Cabal world, it still poses a big threat. But both Moscow and Beijing are looking to head it off before it escalates to a full-blown sort of confrontation. Now, the escalation of US troop deployment and the threat posed by Daesh are not seen as a coincidence. And when Daesh said they were going to war with the Taliban in Afghanistan, it had all the hallmarks of another attempt by the US capitalists to regain control in Afghanistan and an attempt to prevent the expansion of the One Belt, One Road, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which Afghanistan may ultimately become a full member, and the expansion of the multipolar world. Now, whilst opium is known to be one of the many reasons why US and UK forces remain in Afghanistan, there are vast mineral resources there worth, some people say trillions of dollars or tens of billions of dollars, and it includes the likes of uranium and thorium, etc. Now, members of the Afghan parliament stated that they had evidence that uranium was being smuggled out in US cargo planes by a US military base located near the uranium mines. And we know that the US and the UK have concentrated military bases near the largest poppy plantations too. So there is this staggering hypocrisy that the US coalition forces are there under the pretext of safeguarding and counter-terrorism measures whilst they're actually stealing Afghan assets. However, despite all that, we should note that the US military has indeed in recent times been targeting drug production facilities via a new Trump administration initiative. This is actually true and correct. And in this regard, the US is conducting bombing raids. But the days of the kind of insane actions and the cabal are drawing to a close. They're going to find out soon enough that things are not going to work out how they quite imagine. Yes, the immediate future of Afghanistan remains precarious, but only this time they will have the support of the Shanghai cooperation nations, such as China, Russia, Pakistan, and Iran. So the fight to eliminate the cabal-sponsored terrorism continues in earnest. Now, we can neatly sort of segue into Pakistan and the US in this process because there has been some interesting developments. Now, what was for me a big signal of the weakness of the United States on the world stage was when Pakistan's Foreign Office stated recently that the country needs no financial assistance from the US, which obviously the US accuses Pakistan of ignoring effective operations in the war on terror. And Pakistan doesn't need financial assistance from the US. And frankly, it doesn't care anymore, given that if the funds were stopped, it would hardly make any difference to the country's economy for reasons apart from the big, huge Chinese investment. Now, this coalition support fund that was supposed to give aid to Pakistan was a reimbursement from the US for expenses incurred in operations against militants and compensation for logistical facilities that were made available to the coalition forces that were operating in Afghanistan. Now, of course, as the relations between the US and Pakistan have soured in recent months, the Trump administration said they were going to withhold $255 million in aid to Pakistan as a show of their irritation with Pakistan's intransigent attitude towards confronting terror networks that operate there. And Washington has stated that they insisted that Pakistan take decisive action against these militant and terror groups operating from its soil. Now, Pakistan, unsurprisingly, vehemently rejects the allegations, saying that Pakistan's security forces have undertaken effective operations against terrorism and extremism in recent years. And also, Pakistan's repeatedly informed the US that it has no organized structure of any terrorist outfits existing in Pakistan. And quite rightly, Islamabad said, well, hang on a minute. The US needs to focus on the factors it's responsible for, including the exponential increase in drug production, the expansion of ungoverned territories, the breakdown of governments, and letting Daesh gain a foothold in Afghanistan instead of pressuring Pakistan to do more. Now, of course, the relations soured. Why? Because Trump accused the country of providing a safe haven to agents of chaos, violence, and terror, whilst launching at the same time this US strategy for Afghanistan. Now, the fact that the US has been blaming Pakistan for its failures in the war against terror in Afghanistan and is threatening Pakistan with these dire consequences is action that is causing consternation also within the US military, who fear the loss of a critical ally in the region. Well, yes, they've lost the critical ally effectively. And Pakistan, for its part, is a sovereign country and refutes the Trump administration's attempt to issue these threats of unilateral action against militants and the stopping of financial aid. Now, ironically, the fact that Pakistan's improved its relationship significantly in recent years with two UN veto powers, namely China and Russia, seems lost on Washington, and precisely why Islamabad no longer needs any backing from the US in terms of its international and national affairs. Now, one big development that's come out recently, which is hugely interesting and possibly why there's been sort of poking at Pakistan regarding this financial aid. Beijing's planning to build its second offshore naval base. Now, this is near the strategically important Pakistani port of Gwadar, and that's following the opening of the first facility in Djibouti, which was on the Horn of Africa. Now, this new base near the Gwadar port, which is on the Arabian Sea, is going to be used to dock and maintain naval vessels as well as provide logistical support services. Now, why does China need to set up another base in Gwadar and not just use Gwadar? Well, Gwadar is a civilian port, and it's common practice to have separate facilities for warships and merchant vessels because they have different requirements. Merchant ships need a bigger port with a lot of space for warehouses and containers, but warships need a full range of maintenance and logistical support services. So that's pretty obvious. Now, the confirmation follows meetings that were going on, which the US must have been aware of, between high-ranking Chinese and Pakistani military officers, which indicated that Beijing would build a military base on the Jiwani Peninsula near Gwadar. Interestingly, it's also very close to the Iranian border. That may be a coincidence, but I suspect not. And as well as the naval base, there'll be an expansion of existing airport on this peninsula and the establishment of a security zone. And just to add further sort of fuel to the fire, what also happened just very recently, China's welcomed Pakistan's move allowing the yuan to be used for imports, exports, and financing transactions for bilateral trade and investment activities. This bilateral money cooperation has been deepening between China and Pakistan since they signed a bilateral currency swap agreement back in 2011. So Pakistan's central bank stated that public and private sector enterprises may use the yuan for bilateral trade and investment. So, there's another, whammy to add to the other whammies, and precisely why there's consternation coming out of elements within Washington, because they can see that Pakistan is rotating away from Washington as an ally, and it's also now looking to trade with China in non-dollar terms. So as Pakistan and China get on with things, most of the Middle East is asleep at the wheel. The Gwadar Free Zone is offering guaranteed long-term economic and tax regime that will crush everyone and everything, including the UAE in the Middle East. China's already invested, I think, nearly $70 billion equivalent in Gwadar. So no wonder Washington's now an irrelevance, and why non-US denominated trade is going to be a big issue in 2018. And what's Pakistan also now saying? We're going to consider the option of blocking supplies of US troops deployed in Afghanistan through its territory. And what's that going? That's going to be a major logistical problem for the US, because the US troops in Afghanistan are supplied with food and military equipment by the routes from Pakistan to Afghanistan. We also had the Pakistani government who turned Trump's tweets about immigration issues, and they're going to announce that they're going to send 1.5 million Afghan refugees back to Afghanistan within 30 days. Now, ordinarily, Pakistan would have risked drawing huge pressure from the State Department on exaggerated claim that it's violating the human rights of the refugees, but that can't be levied at them because of Trump's tweet, Trump's comment. So since the US will not allow Afghan refugees in its own country, it's forced to accept Pakistan's expulsion of these 1.5 million on the implicit basis that they must also constitute a serious terrorist threat to Pakistan. So in a way, Islam's found this hugely creative way to strike back at Washington. And it becomes a double whammy, because Pakistan gets rid of potential terrorist sleeper cells, but it's going to create a major crisis for Kabul in terms of destabilizing their nation in the process. It's going to be very damaging to the US, because the Kabul is unable to Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan, is unable to accommodate what would amount to about a 3% increase in its total population in the space of 30 days. Given that the Kabul government exerts little influence beyond the capital and has no sway in approximately half of the country that's under the control of the Taliban. So the reality is that the vast majority of these 1.5 million people are more than likely going to side with the Taliban than Kabul. And consequently, it's going to make this situation so much more difficult for the US to control. Now, given that the idea of moving these refugees back to Afghanistan from Pakistan's been in the works for quite a while, once again, you suspect the US was aware of this. And these are all reasons why we're seeing the escalation of tensions between Pakistan and the US. And the idea that $255 million is going to sway the Pakistanis is ridiculous, but it's yet another example of the waning influence of the US cabal in or the cabal full stop, in terms of not just the Middle East, but now in terms of Pakistan in the process, and Afghanistan, and everywhere else in that region for that matter.
Now, since the cabal is losing power, and you can just see it all throughout the Middle East here in the country, and there's indictments coming down, do you think they might try some type of false flag or an event to distract from what is coming?
Well, it's the age-old $64 million question. I mean, there was certainly evidence there was a possibility of a false flag attack in the Middle East to implicate Iran and to impose further sanctions because the military option was not on the cards. That failed. And in a general sense, who's going to launch a major false flag attack in Europe and the US aside from small-scale terror attacks, well, which are ongoing? I don't think they have the capability to do that. We've seen in the US there was attempts at gun control through false flags. It all failed. Then there was also through the likes of Antifa to divide and conquer the Americans. That fizzled out very rapidly. And there was no evidence that that was ever going to succeed, despite significant funding to the contrary. Now, we can't rule out wars per se, but there is no solid evidence at this stage that that's a possibility. Washington and its allies, as we said earlier, are militarily light years behind Moscow, and for that matter, to some extent, Beijing too. That totally changes the geopolitical landscape as a result of it. I think the cabal, I would never say never, and you always have to be careful, that you don't rule something out, then it happens at some point in the future. But I'm not seeing any evidence at the moment that they can instigate a false flag event. If they were going to do something in the Middle East with Iran and they failed to do it, I just think, what are they going to launch in Europe that's going to convince people of what exactly? I don't see they're going to convince people in Europe of anything. What are they going to do? Launch something, a major scale attack by Daesh operatives or the Islamic State? That's not going to change anything. That's not going to help them in any way, shape, or form. They're not going to be able to launch an attack in Europe and blame it on Iran. Because simply no one's going to buy this or believe it. And in terms of the US, well, what they've had attempts over the last few years to try instigate some sort of divide and conquer mentality or attempts at gun control, it's all failed. And with the Trump administration, I just simply don't see that as a possibility. And war is increasingly less of an issue. There was an attempt in North Korea, it failed. We saw it in Ukraine, it failed. They failed in Syria. They tried to instigate something with Lebanon, with Hariri, who went to Saudi and was complaining bitterly about the Iranians and Hezbollah in Lebanon. It failed. He went back. He's now part of the government, and the country's never been more united. So again, another ultimate failure. Some people will argue.
What about a cyber attack? I mean, they could say, this came out of North Korea, and if they, blast it all over the corporate media, they really don't need that much proof, because every time there is some type of cyber attack or something happening, they really don't show any proof. They could try to convince the world of this just by blasting it all over the place.
Yeah, we're going to get on to cyber. I mean, cyber attacks certainly are a big problem. I mean, they've tried to implicate North Korea in things in the past, and no one's bought it, because immediately the Russians and the Chinese just stamp on it and go, look, this is just simply not possible. Yes, they may be able to convince people in Western nations who are largely ignorant of that someone's responsible for something. But that's irrelevant, because what's in today's newspaper is forgotten tomorrow. And we've seen that repeatedly. People have a very short attention span on such matters. The important thing is the vast majority of the world simply won't buy these things anymore. So yes, they can try things. Will it have what desired effect it will have is probably very limited, and it will fizzle out pretty quickly. And no one's going to buy it as an excuse to say, well, the North Koreans did this, because they tried to blame the North Koreans for things recently, and it just didn't work. So what are they going to do? Blame the Iranians for something? Nations across the world are simply not going to buy it. So they may attempt to do things, but ultimately, I think the cabal's starting to realize that everything they plan is blowing up in their own face. So increasingly, the same with Lebanon, any attempts to destabilize Lebanon's had the reverse effect. So you can't rule anything out and say that there isn't a risk they'll happen. I think it's more a question, well, if it happens, what's the consequential effects? And I think it's minimal that they can achieve. They'd have to try something pretty huge for it to have any effect. And I simply just don't see how that's going to be possible. I mean, there's a lot of rumors in the past about they're trying to launch nuclear strikes in the US and all sorts of things. I'm not sure whether any of that's reality. I've got no way of verifying that one way or the other, but it would have to be something that huge. And who's going to buy this idea that Iran did something? It's just simply not going to wash. If they couldn't pull it off in the Middle East, which was far more believable, that Iran was responsible for something, I don't see how they're going to pull it off that Iran was responsible for an attack that suddenly happened, say, in the US or in Europe or somewhere else. So yes, we can't say things won't happen, but I think the damage that they could inflict is significantly less than than if they tried this 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And that's the argument. When they had opportunities to do it, and they may have got away with it, they didn't do it. So I think logistically, it's not as simple as people imagine that it could happen. But yeah, we should never dismiss. And Russia and China and other nations, precisely for that reason, don't dismiss it lightly and are always on guard and always vigilant as to the risks they pose, and on a daily basis. And there's no doubt certain things have been prevented in the past from happening, and through back channel communications with the US and other nations to prevent the risk of these sort of events happening. So I think that's something else we need to factor into our thinking.
Now, since the cabal system is dying, I mean, the whole system was based on the petrodollar, and we see, China introducing the petro-yuan. We see a duplication of what is happening out in the East. They have the payment system, the exchanges, and things like that. And other countries are making bilateral trade agreements with China. They're joining up to the One Belt, One Road. Where does this leave the Western world right now as this system dies? Because the countries in the Middle East, are they going to still use the dollar? Are they going to, say, yeah, we're going to still use the dollar to pay for the oil, or are they going to start to switch into different currencies? Is the global economy going to collapse because the cabal is collapsing?
Well, yeah, yes, I think very much so. There's the economic illusion of the markets that, the higher the Dow, from my perspective, the greater the desperation. They can keep raising it to 50,000. It just shows how desperate they are. We have all this central bank intervention. You've got high frequency trading and algos, and there's declining retail participation in stock markets. You've got share buybacks. And so there's all this economic illusion. We could talk for weeks about it, but I think people have talked that to death. There's the economic reality. There's more economically inactive people in Western nations. I'm not going to just pick on the US because we always tend to pick on them. But, food stamps or equivalent is through the roof. There's very high unemployment across Western nations, enormous debt bubbles, credit cards, student loans, auto loans, the list grows. You've got bloated central bank balances across the world, like the Bank of Japan owning 70+% of Nikkei stocks. You've got the Swiss National Bank that holds 85 billion and maybe 100 billion now in US stocks. You've got corporations buying up US treasuries, the Exchange Stabilization Fund acquiring dumped US treasuries to hide the fact that dumping's going on. We know the Fed's balance sheet is full of toxic asset. The ECB is in a total mess, and it's going to carry on with QE to infinity, ad infinitum. And then you've got government tax receipts and government current expenditures widening, trade deficit. Let's just look at the UK and the US in the last 12 months. The UK was 170 billion in deficit, the US 800 billion. The retail sector's in collapse. There's this very weak manufacturing base. Total revolving credit, which is owned and securitized, has risen back to pre-2008 levels. No surprise. And total non-revolving credit is the sharpest rise since data was recorded and has risen consistently since 2008. So what's non-revolving credit is home loans, car loans, business loans, and revolving credit is credit cards and home equity lines of credit. So another example. Subprime crisis is coming again and worse than 2008. The shale oil industry has junk bond status and there's a risk of default, despite home ownership levels are collapsing. That's once the bedrock of many Western economies. You've got pension shortfalls, de-dollarization, as you said, failing and failed banking systems. I think the collapse of gold and silver paper markets is coming, and you'll see the return of true price discovery. And the true price discovery is going to be a major death knell for the cabal financial Ponzi scheme, effectively. Now, something I know we've got in the list of questions, and you mentioned, is the economic power moving from west to east as a result of this? Well, bluntly, the answer is no. And there are reasons why. Yes, we are witnessing the death of the fiat Ponzi paper scheme and the birth of the new financial paradigm, which will be adopted globally. The fact it originates in the East is simply because there is no other way of rolling it out globally, given the control the cabal's had on Western nations in particular. Now, the financial reset, much is said about this, and from my perspective, much is misunderstood. It's simply bringing about an end to the fiat debacle and resurrecting the concept of sound money, and this will be via gold, silver, and maybe some people think this is controversial, but asset-backed cryptocurrencies are going to come to the fore in 2018 and beyond. Not current first generation cryptocurrencies. Not saying they won't survive, but for me, that's not the concept of sound money. People can disagree, but from my understanding, it's gold, silver, and asset-backed cryptocurrencies. Another important point is China is not controlled by any faction of the cabal. It's utter nonsense, and if people know Chinese history, it's self-explanatory. Start with the Opium Wars and work backwards. And we know the cabals, historically fought wars on three fronts: militarily, economically, financially. Well, we know militarily they failed. They've lost the economic war because of this long-term strategy of zero interest rate policy in QE. And the only war they've got left is to try and preserve the US dollar. Well, in the process, they've shot themselves in the head, foot, torso, and arms, Russian sanctions being one example. So China and Russia bring about this non-US denominated world via the One Belt, One Road, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, Chinese interbank payment system as an alternative to SWIFT, the MIR, which is the Russian alternative, bilateral trade deals, non-dollar terms, etc. So yeah, Russia, China, and other nations want to bring an end to the Kabbalists and their potent weapon of destruction, namely the dollar. China and Russia understand the concept of sound money, not uniquely, of course. It's a store of value, a measure of value, and a standard of value, and a medium of exchange. That's why they've acquired huge amounts of gold. We've said this before. They have probably around 40,000 tons each. I think Russia has actually got more than China. So they're going to have gold-backed currencies in the future. The yuan and ruble are supposed to simultaneously be launched. China's rotating its economy, and this is partly why the One Belt, One Road is coming to existence. But we're seeing the rapid birth of the One Belt, One Road, and this is why the idea that we're destroying economies in the West and it's all moving east, it isn't. The end goal is the whole world is going to embrace the One Belt, One Road. It has to. It will adopt sound money principles, and we'll see the expansion through Asia and into Europe, from Lisbon in the west to Vladivostok in the east. And the One Belt, One Road model is pretty self-explanatory, but lost on many people in the West. It's bringing about rapid reindustrialization of Asia and ultimately Europe, and including critical infrastructure such as rail and maritime links. It's absolutely not US hegemony Mark II. It is the end of the cabal in totality. That for me is 100% cast iron guarantee, and I'm happy to say it publicly, and I've said it before, and I'll say it today. So then it raises the question, and it's sort of kind of leading into other questions, but it's kind of flowing through what we're discussing. But we're going to ask the question, is the US preparing to join the One Belt, One Road system? Well, currently there's no evidence to support that viewpoint, but eventually, yes, they very much will. Everyone will have to join or face utter economic and geopolitical oblivion. But the reasons the US will not join now revolve around the US dollar. I mean, to do so, you'd send signals to the world that the US was abandoning the dollar, and for obvious reasons, that's not going to happen at this time. But it's why the Trump administration is playing games with regards to China and Russia, because they can't be seen to embrace both nations, but eventually they will do in totality. The US will join the One Belt, One Road. It will join the AIIB. It will join the concept of sound money, because the whole world is moving to that. But it is nothing to do with the cabal. It's just common sense. And in a post-cabal world, it's so simple and ridiculously easy to roll out, because there won't be the obstruction. Yes, there's going to be cultural obstructions. Nations will find it hard to adjust. But in principle, it's not a complicated process to adopt. Countless nations already have, and they're seeing the win-win situations that benefit, both nations involved, whether it's China and Nation X involved in trade deals or in terms of infrastructure deals or whatever it is, or is it simply currency swaps, whatever it is. So without any shadow of doubt, yes, the US will join at some point. It has to, and it knows it will. Trump knows full well that it will have to adopt the whole One Belt, One Road initiative. And the US will do very well out of it in the future. Okay, at the moment, it's not on the cards because for the reasons we've stated. And it makes complete sense why there was this huge fear that when Trump got elected, he'd suddenly just rotate to China and Russia and embrace them and say, well, the Cold War's ended, the trade wars are ended. It's not that simple process, because there is a time. It's not a time-driven process. It's event-driven. But at the right time, yes, the US will embrace it, and it will make the US a much stronger nation in the process. and become this strong nation amongst equals, which it very much needs to be, and which China, Russia would very much welcome. Contrary to what people think, this isn't the China and Russia don't want to destroy the US. They just want to destroy the cabal and the dollar. And of course, that has to happen, because if it doesn't happen, the cabal will carry on. And the one thing regarding the whole financial reset that's worth mentioning is when the reset happens, it will be the death of the Federal Reserve note. So effectively, the cabal can have trillions of dollars, but where are they going to spend them? Nowhere. So let them have their trillions of dollars. Let them hide them away in some far-flung corner of the world, because they'll be absolutely useless doing them. And the Chinese and the Russians know full well that's why you don't have to fight the cabal in that respect. You don't have to asset strip them and steal everything from them, because eventually everything they own will be worthless. And that's the simplicity of the process of what the financial reset will also do.
Paul, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see your work?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for asking us to come on again. We very much appreciate it. Yeah, if they go to thesiriusreport.com, that's the website. That's all free material. Yes, there is an option on there to subscribe to our podcast subscription service, which is $4.75 a month. It's very cheap. You get 5 podcasts a week. We've done 321 already, and they're only short, 10 to 15 minutes, but it's very condensed information, and we think it's great value for money. And we thank everyone who has subscribed, and would like to encourage everyone else to subscribe. And we have the Twitter page, The Sirius Report, and obviously the Facebook group, which is The Sirius Report. And thanks very much for having us on. We much appreciate it, and it's always very enjoyable to come on and have a chat with you.
Yes, thank you very much for being on the Spotlight. I really appreciate it, and thank you for all the information that you've given us. Thank you very much.